plants are out there. So this is where I work, the cottage.
Good. Well, let me introduce you because we're
Okay.
sort of going live at this
Great.
point. I am talking today with an author of a new book called Freeing Jesus. And that's a friend of mine, Diana Butler Bass, who is also an academic and a professor and has done many things, but we're going to talk about her. This is the book. I don't know if you can see how many pages I've turned down here. Do you see?
Oh my gosh.
Yes, I read it.
You did.
I marked many places, and I wanted to start today before we, get into the discussion by asking you about yourself a little bit. And then I have a passage, I like when I read a book to try to find a paragraph or a line or two that I think in a way is where the essence of the book lies, where the writer has managed not even intentionally to summarize, but somehow it's like, okay, this is what this book is about. And I picked a passage, so you'll be interested. It is on page 199. So it took you 199 pages to finally get there, but you did. No, I'm only kidding. But I'll read it to you in a minute. But before we get in there, for people who don't know you, we both come from evangelical backgrounds. We both sort of left them and also retained elements of faith in our life in terms of looking for meaning and what we've derived from this. We're going to talk about your book in some depth here, but why don't you, the book has a little bit of a thumbnail about your own journey, Diana, as a human being, as a person raised as a Christian in evangelical Christianity. A little bit of the PTSD, I guess, you've suffered coming out of that, and it's a lifelong journey and battle. I want to get into other elements of the book, but why don't you give me a thumbnail history of your life as just a human being and someone who has, walked this path of faith, but at the same time really left the charted, safe territory that you grew up in and made other decisions. Can you just give me a thumbnail of that? Because otherwise I've got to try to reconstruct your life from the book, and I think you know more about it than me.
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the differences between the two of us and something I think, fuels the energy, when we talk together, is that my background is a little different from yours.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in a fairly conventional Methodist family.
Right.
I was born in 1959, lived in a heavily German immigrant neighborhood in Baltimore City. And so my first experiences of church were of a fairly, what I would call sort of 1950s, 1960s, generous, mostly theologically liberal, but still somehow culturally conservative Protestantism that was very typical in the middle part of the 20th century. And so that's where I started. But when I was 13 years old, my folks moved from Maryland to Arizona, and they broke ties with the Methodist Church, and they were pretty young. They were only in their 30s, and they sort of went off on their own sort of spiritual and personal journeys, leaving us kids, I had a brother and sister, to our own devices. And it was at that point, as a young teenager, when I fell into evangelical Christianity and chose it for myself. Yeah. And that became the next stage of my life through my teen years and early adulthood.
And what brand of evangelicalism was that, the beginning for you? What did you fall into, as you put it?
The church that I joined in Scottsdale as a 14-year-old was a church called Scottsdale Bible Church. And then it had about 300 members. And now I think it has 20,000.
Oh, okay. They were doing all right.
It's a giant mega church now. Yeah. And I almost every time I go back to Scottsdale, I just sort of drive onto the campus and I look at it and go, wow, it's got a seminary and all kinds of stuff. But it was a pretty, it was a church that at its very beginning was deeply shaped by Dallas Theological Seminary.
Sure.
And so all of the first things I knew of evangelical Christianity was what I would call, it was more open than fundamentalism, but less open than some other parts of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a hybrid of the two. And yet everything was about the end of the world and dispensationalism. And I can remember sitting in church, having grown up Methodist with 10-minute sermons. And there was this one time the pastor of our church preached a 55-minute sermon on less than half of a verse from the book of Chronicles. And I can remember as a teenager just being completely astonished by this. And so that's where my first exposure to evangelicalism was, in that tradition. But it was also the 1970s. So it was kind of the beginning of Christian rock. And my friends and I would go to Young Life and Christian rock concerts. And I heard, like Larry Norman and Keith Green and Randy Stonehill and kind of these classical rock, the people who really founded Christian rock and roll, in concerts in churches all over Phoenix. And then I went to an evangelical college, Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. Yeah. And then I went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And that's where we first met. Although I remember
you and I met there. Yeah.
Yeah. We've mentioned this before. There, you did not remember me, and there's no reason you would, but I was just a student, and you were like the famous son of Francis Schaeffer, and you came to campus to present, I think, one of your books, and I was in that conversation, and so that's where we met. But then after that, Gordon Conwell.
And that would have been what year do you think?
I was at Gordon Conwell between 82 and 87.
Okay. So basically, whenever we intersected, that was very close to the time when I was kind of getting ready to flee. So it's interesting because you probably saw one of the last times I was showing up in an evangelical context as a full bore son of Francis Schaeffer about to do all this stuff. Because soon after that, by 85, I was in Hollywood trying to get out of the whole thing, making second-rate feature films. So we were like ships passing in the night.
Well, I do remember at Gordon Conwell, one of the professors saying that you were having issues.
Yeah, that was a nice way to put it.
And that was always, the warning sign.
Yeah, it was. And probably, there may be a little apostasy slipping in here or whatever it might be.
Right. And I was not having issues at that point. I was trying to prove myself.
Yeah.
And so at Gordon Conwell, I was busy trying to fit in to the intellectual culture of evangelicalism in the 80s. Then I went on to Duke to get a PhD. And it was when I was at Duke, things really started. I realized I can't do this anymore. And it was about halfway through that.
So you were starting to have your own issues, as it were.
Yeah. About 1990. Yeah. And it's funny because it's, it's Pride Month. And one of the big issues that was one of my first moments of, I don't write about this in Freeing Jesus just because it didn't fit the narrative, but it is part of the story. In 1989, one of my best friends from college died of AIDS. And he had kept the fact that he was gay secret from all his friends. And we just literally didn't know until his funeral. And so the shock of being at this church in San Diego and having half of the people there be this sort of these evangelical young adults, and the other half being people from the Pride community in San Diego. And I can remember us sitting across, from one another at the church, and people were going like, I had no idea that those people existed. And that whole event just really was one of the pieces of my worldview that began to question a lot.
Make things shake up a little bit.
Yeah. And
so no, go ahead. I was just going to say, I understand that.
So the book proceeds basically in those three movements, growing up United Methodist, this extended journey that I had within evangelicalism, especially in the 70s, 80s, and early 1990s.
Yeah.
And then having to leave that and becoming the person I've become.
Yeah.
And that's, that's
And
how
if you
we.
fast forward to this moment, and then we'll get into the book. And let me just pause here to say, again, we are discussing with Diana Butler Bass her new book, Freeing Jesus, which I was showing her earlier. I have, what do you call that when you fold pages over and ruin books? What is
I always
that?
call it dog-eared.
Yeah, dog-eared. When I have dog-eared the whole book from one end to the other and marked a lot of passages. But we'll get into the book in a little minute here. So on the personal side, all right, somewhere in this, that's the theological journey. What about the personal journey in terms of relationships and where you live and the stage of life? And who do you hear from most by email when that was still being used? I hear from a lot of people who came out of an evangelical background and are trying to grimly hold on to something or other, not sure what, because, a bit of a lightning rod for that. And I know you are too, but talk about yourself personally for a minute first. This is Frank Schaeffer. We're live here on YouTube, and this will be on Facebook and also as a podcast with my friend Diana Butler Bass, and we're discussing her book, Freeing Jesus. So can you do a little more of the personal raconteur about your own life outside of theology?
The the fun part about that story that I was just telling you, and then I landed here, in the 1990s. And where I landed is I wound up getting remarried. I had been married to a person who was very evangelical in my first marriage, and then I got remarried, and I married this guy who was a liberal Presbyterian, and we are celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary this year. We're in our early 60s. I'm 62, and today's actually his birthday. He turned 66.
And what's his
And
name?
his name is Richard.
So happy birthday, Richard.
Yeah. And we have a stepson. I have a stepson. I have a beautiful daughter. And it's in the context of that remarriage that I really shifted my work over toward writing more about mainline churches.
Yeah.
And so in the last 25 years, having gotten remarried and finding myself in different kinds of churches and raising two fairly liberal millennial kids and all this kind of stuff, my work got associated with liberal mainline people.
Yes.
And so for the longest time, you asked me about my email, who sends me email. On a daily basis, my email for years and years and years would be all mainline clergy, mostly people who were worried about if their churches were going to survive, if their denominations were going to survive. People kind of forgot that I had this sort of evangelical background. And it's only recently that I've started to sort of reclaim that. And, sort of the more personal stuff is that, I love art. I love gardening. I love to read. I love to travel. I just
when you speak, you're out on the road quite a bit.
I am.
I know you and I cross paths sometimes, I guess most recently a couple of years ago at the Wild Goose Festival that we've both been to. And I'll be down there again this autumn, having missed last year because of COVID. And I'm wondering, what would you say is the sort of typical venue where you speak, and how often are you out on the road these days? Or aside from the COVID anomaly, I mean, in regular life?
Yeah, pre-pandemic, I was putting 100,000 miles per year on United. And that would take me to I think that probably 3/4 of my work was in mainline churches. And so nearly, I'd say probably half of the weekends of the year, I would be out in some Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, Congregationalist church, leading workshops, teaching people, and preaching. And so that was pretty typical. The other third of my life, I might be working in a college setting, teaching at a seminary, leading a retreat, just all kinds of different type venues where people are interested in spirituality, changes in spirituality. Before the pandemic, I was doing a lot of lecturing on religion and politics, which is something I enjoy.
Sure.
So so that's the kind of thing that I've been doing, just traveling.
Yeah. Did you find, with the Trump years, because of the white evangelical base that essentially was the underpinning of his entire presidency, you can take Vladimir Putin out and you can take the militias out and you can take Fox News out, but what you can't take out of the equation is the evangelical community. They made him, kept him president. 70% of them say the election was stolen. They sort of going with the big lie. I found, and I'm asking you what happened to you, that, I had sort of seen a lot of my own work in this area almost in the past, like, okay, that was then, and now we're moving forward and Hillary will be president and, this part of my life is over and I'll do some other things. And of course, after the presidency of Donald Trump, to put it very mildly, the evangelical movement is front and center in the news and very much part of the American mix, because without it, there is not a Trump Republican Party. That is Trump Republican Party, led by people like Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham and others who I knew well growing up as part of the community. How did that affect your, I won't call it a ministry, but your public persona? Because surely you're getting asked about this just like I've been. Why is this happening? How is this possible? Who are these people? What's this got to do with being evangelical? Just talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think the first way that it began to have an impact on my work was that before, it was very clear that things were going wrong within evangelicalism. And over the course of the last 12 years, I would say every single year when I was out on the road, more and more people would come up to me, I was speaking at First Congregational Church and wherever, Nashua, New Hampshire. And they would say, I used to be an evangelical, but I've left. And they almost always said that they left for some political reason, that their church had decided that you couldn't be a Democrat and still be a Christian, or a lot of stuff about women's issues and gay issues were sort of, and it was very clear that there was this stream of people that was flooding out of evangelicalism, and some level of them were coming toward mainline churches. So I started running into those folks on the road. And after Trump was elected, what had been kind of a steady stream became nearly an explosion.
River.
Yeah. I mean, it was huge. And all of a sudden I realized that my background in evangelicalism, I really kind of wanted to start to talk about it again, because I was receiving these stories from, all of these folks, and there was unprocessed grief. There was trauma. There were people who were 10, 20, sometimes 30 years younger than myself, who didn't know how did this happen? They kept asking over and over again. And that they didn't even know the history of their own movement. And so in recent years, I've gotten I think just a lot more concerned with, in a sense, spiritually, and even, I'm not a pastor, but I feel some level of pastoral care toward folks who feel homeless, by and large, from this huge shift that we both know so much about, that rightward political shift of evangelicalism, and how it displaced hundreds of thousands, if not more, people.
Not to even mention the next generation looking at what they might belong to. I mean, they're not displaced as much as, like, forget this, whatever that is, we're not having any part of it.
Yeah. And I can't, I can't really blame them. And there are so many levels to these questions about religious decline and people leaving evangelicalism. I frequently now run into, say, young mainline ministers who grew up Southern Baptist or Missouri Synod Lutheran, some sort of evangelical denomination. And they come into the Episcopal Church or the Presbyterian Church, and they've been told their entire lives that liberalism, theological liberalism, is bad. And yet they wind up being pastors in mainline denominations where theological liberalism is one of the shaping currents of the tradition. And so I see these young pastors, and they don't know how to speak into the traditions that they're now part of.
Right.
And I find that to be a big concern. And
when you say they don't know how to speak into the tradition, be specific.
Well, there's a kind of, it's really interesting that people have left evangelical settings because they disagreed with politics. So they disagreed. They thought that women should be able to be ordained. They have generally looser ideas about things like abortion, the abortion should be permitted legally, etc. And they certainly aren't opposed to gay marriage or people or any kind of legal rights for gay, lesbian, transgender people. So they have these very politically liberal attitudes, but they grew up with this sort of vaccine against Protestant liberal theology. And so I'm literally watching now within mainline churches, there are these sort of young political progressives who are theologically hating on the traditions of those own churches, which is kind of problematic.
What would you say the linchpin of their discomfort, if you had to summarize it for an alien? What is the linchpin of the discomfort with someone who grows up evangelical, moves to the progressive side on a more political front, but brings with them the theological presuppositions and baggage from their fundamentalist childhoods? What's that hinge on?
I think it hinges around biblical criticism, that they're still very uncomfortable with anything that resembles textual, literary, or historical criticism of the Bible, and that they want to hold on to much more literalist. I mean, it's a little bit shocking, but they want to hold on to much more literalist interpretations of both the Bible and the creeds. And there was one Twitter page I followed for a long time of a young lesbian Episcopal priest. And she said, I read the Bible conservatively, therefore I love gay people, or therefore I'm a lesbian. It was something like that. And I looked at that and I thought, well, that's kind of odd, because if the Episcopal Church had read the Bible literally, when it was deciding to ordain lesbians as priests, that never would have happened. And so there, I think what the concern is, Frank, and I'd be interested in your take on this, is that once people leave evangelicalism, they leave it to a certain level. But there are still aspects of one's, I think, character, maybe one's spiritual journey, where you're still trying to speak backwards to the community that you left. And so if you can hold on to say, like, oh, I still believe in a literal virgin birth, or I still believe in, whatever the creedal literalism is, or the biblical literalism is. You can say to your friends who are back here, I may think gay people can get married, but I'm still really Christian.
Right. There's always kind of defined. I think, you were asking me my opinion on, I think there's two things. I think that the level of conditioning and trauma that comes with an evangelical background, even if one converts to it late, but is indoctrinated thoroughly, say goes to a seminary or a college or high school, let alone the kid raised in a homeschool family, is much deeper than we think. And so since they are unwilling to deal with paradox and admit that the parts they're holding on to are not logical, but they have a psychological root in their own background, and be happy with that and just admit that, everything is still sort of in the area of black and white truth. So for instance, people ask me why I still pray, yet at the same time describe myself as an atheist, and then say that I'm an atheist who believes in God, kind of a deliberate paradoxical statement. In the old days, I would try to argue it and balance it, and I'm still this, I'm still that, very much what you're talking about. And now I just say, that's the way my mother raised me. Have you got a problem with that? Or do you have any other better reason for how you are? And recognize that there's a complete separation between what is true, whether we know that or not, what the truth is, and how I feel about things. They're not one and the same. So what you bring with you from your background, once you understand that that's your personal baggage, but it is not a system of thought that makes sense. It's paradoxical, but somehow there's some peace in recognizing that rather than trying to make this all still fit together. But I think there's another reason, and this, forgive my cynicism, and that is I think a lot of people who earn their living from things that are related to theology, present company accepted, also are looking sometimes where the book sales are, the fire is, the salary, and they look at a diminishing kind of return on liberal theology in terms of numbers and churches filled with graying heads and generational passage, and they say, well, you know, where the action is in that 20,000 member mega church that you used to belong to. They probably all voted for Donald Trump and so forth. And so to relinquish, without thinking of anybody specific in terms of the evangelical world, but to relinquish all ties with the sound and fury and book sales and speaking fees and all the rest of the more dynamic, fundamentalist, gung-ho, fired up, angry part of the thing. You know, if you're in this world, you're going to want to keep some sort of connection because, hey, that's where the action is. Now, that's simplistic, but I'm afraid that's sometimes true. So like, how do you ever get invited back to speak at Wheaton College if you really burn the bridge? And you know, whatever that might be.
And that's what, you know, my life wound up doing, was burning certain kinds of bridges. And you know, and that's okay. You know, there are some places that you don't want to go back to, even though you might want to still be friends with some people who are in those places. It doesn't mean that you owe those institutions an explanation. And I do think, you know, sadly, your cynicism is probably right. You know, so you look at the religious market and you say, well, where's the action? And maybe you don't want to write books or have big book sales, but certainly most pastors want to have a big church.
Well, that's what I meant. When I said books, I just brought it into my own territory, my own turf where I understand it better. But of course, I'm talking about church size and attendance and gifts and who puts money in the collection plate. And, you know, it's like those sermons you hear about, you know, interpreting the passages on wealth. And then the pastor quickly adds, but, you know, the Bible's not against rich people. This is to illustrate a point, because, of course, he's looking at the three people in the front row who subsidize the church with their donations. And he doesn't want to piss off Harry here, you know, who started an auto parts company and built the building.
Well, I remember, you know, we have a thunderstorm moving overhead. Let me switch on some lights real quick. I'll be right back.
Well, you still look good. You still look good.
I think I'll be very dark in just a second. So,
we don't want to give ammunition to those who have denounced you as a heretic. You know, Diana Butler Bass comes on and immediately her house is struck by lightning. I mean, please don't do that, because it's going to, you know, that's the bit that's going to go viral.
I think I'll be okay.
All right.
What I was going to say was, there was this thing that happened to me a long time ago.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, I grew up in a world where when I looked at speakers, like, you know, these big conferences I went to in college, the Urbana missionary conferences, and I saw people speaking at those, and I thought, oh, that's what I want to do. And you see a speaker in a room with 18,000 college students, and there was a sense that they were going to, you know, take over the world. There was power in all those numbers. And everybody read those books, and we knew their names, and you know, there was a kind of real Christian celebrity about it. And I thought that's something I would like to do. But years later, after I'd left evangelicalism and I was writing mostly about mainline churches, I was presenting one of my very early books to the United Church of Canada. And we were at this lovely conference center up in the Rockies in Canada. And there were a good number of people there, maybe 200 people, 250. And this one pastor walks up to me and she says, Diana, I got to tell you how much I love this book. This book has changed the way I see the whole world. It's a revolutionary way of looking at congregations. As a matter of fact, I went out and I bought copies for every single person in my church to read.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know what my face looked like, but she realized, she said, oh, but I don't want you to get too excited because, I'm having visions of the New York Times bestseller list.
Yeah.
And she said, I don't want you to get too excited because there are 14 people in my church.
Yeah, that's like, we're talking a book club here.
Right. And, I remember standing there at first going like, oh, 14 people.
Yeah.
But that became for me a real lesson in humility.
Yeah.
And it was important for me to hear that at that moment, because I really appreciate those 14 people in that congregation in Edmonton, Alberta.
Yeah.
I still remember where the church was. I remember what the pastor looked like, and that they would spend time in their tiny church with my words, and that my words meant something about their thinking about the future and what their faith meant to the world.
Yeah.
What a treasure. And so it helped me rearrange sort of the spiritual priorities of my own life. And so you ask, where are you now? And that's the universe I live in. I live in a universe that's smaller, that doesn't think as much about celebrity. As a matter of fact, it kind of looks a little askance at it. And recognizes that oftentimes the most beautiful and surprising things happen in ways that the culture doesn't notice.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. And it very much mirrors the, my trajectory in terms of when I think about the stadiums we used to speak at when we took the seminar series, How Should We Then Live, and Whatever Happened to Human Race out in Grand Ole Opry and, New York and all this stuff. Let me switch gears here for a minute and just reiterate what we're doing. We're talking to Diana Butler Bass. Her new book is Freeing Jesus. I have read it, and I want to jump to a quote on page 199 that I think summed up to me what the book is about. Now, that's a big statement, but I'm going to read it to you. Faith often needs to become more complex before it can become clear again. That sounds paradoxical, perhaps, since we typically define faith as surety. Although it took a couple of years and much wrestling, I came to admit that Christianity itself, as a human story, is profoundly flawed, shot through with all the sins Jesus condemned. Much of its tradition is an exercise of power, and its institutions are far from perfect. Knowing this, I learned that faith must be cloaked in humility and open to honest criticism about where the church had gone wrong. And as a historian, I experienced a kind of graciousness that arises from knowing that in a century or two, we will probably be shown to have contributed to some great injustice or really stupid idea that is invisible to us now. I let go of the need to be so darn certain about things. And as far as I was concerned, I would have put that on the jacket because I think that's the book.
Well, thank you. And
I think the story. That's a great paragraph and it sums up so much of your journey, mine as well. Many of us out there, like Brian McLaren and other friends of ours, but I really think that's the heart of your book. Now, of course, there's a lot more in it than that. But to me, that declaration of uncertainty is so well put and really well backed up by the rest of your book.
Well, I think that the story that I just told about the pastor in Edmonton, it really feeds into that. I mean, I didn't plan to tell that. You didn't know that I was going to tell that story.
And I had that passage picked out, but as soon as you told that story, I went right to my little thing here.
And I I do think that that's the thing that I've learned most about Christianity, is that
Yeah.
at its best, it is an incredibly humble set of practices,
Yeah.
and even a set of humble beliefs.
Yeah.
And the book, I think I've struggled in recent years trying to figure out why why do I stay Christian, with all that's gone on.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a little like you saying about your mom teaching you how to pray.
Yeah.
Part of the reason I certainly stay Christian is that I can't imagine what else I would be.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just kind of a failure of my own theological imagination, but it is who I am. It's the oldest language I know.
Yeah.
And so I have embraced that. And the second part of that is around the person of Jesus. Because I think I could legitimately be who I am, in some ways be Jewish.
Yeah.
Because the values and the ways that I think I see Christianity are very in line with the ways that rabbis who are friends of mine see their tradition. And so, I've one time I did actually say to one of these friends, I said, oh gosh, I think all the time about maybe I should be Jewish. I wish I was Jewish. It would be maybe easier. And he goes, well, it wouldn't be easier. But he said also, you follow Jesus, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he was a great rabbi. Just follow him. You'll be fine.
Yeah.
And that was a gift when he gave that moment to me, because it reminded me that really central to Christian identity is the person of Jesus. And so if I retain Christianity, somehow I have to retain Jesus. And I wasn't entirely sure how to do that in recent years. And that's what this book becomes. It becomes a journey into developing a much more layered understanding.
Yeah, I found that, of course, that's what the book is about. But the point it makes in the end, I think, is the one that I just read. But
yeah, I think you're right too, actually.
Yeah, my sense is that I just want to look at something here. This kind of sums up to me, your own journey to the book. And this is on page 55. Over the years, I have wrestled with scripture, argued and learned from different colleagues, preachers, and scholars, and settled into an understanding of the Bible as a collection of inspired and extraordinary texts that rehearse the spiritual experiences of two ancient faith communities, Jews and Christians, and all the tensions, conflicts, and struggles within and between them. My friend, Bible scholar Peter Enns, describes this much more simply. The Bible is ancient, ambiguous, and diverse. Like him, I have come to experience the Bible as, quote, an invitation to join an ancient, well-traveled, and sacred quest to know God, the world we live in, and our place in it, end quote. I wish someone had told me that in confirmation class. I am certain I would have understood that at 13, or rather, yeah.
Yeah, so, at 13.
Yeah, my sense is that when you look at, your journey, that kind of sums up that part of the journey that you then described as talking to this rabbi and so forth. And I think that's, succinctly sums that up. But I have a question for you that came out of a discussion I had with someone I interviewed the other day, the musician and composer Moby, who is also, a well-known musician. And if you get a chance, you should watch that interview, because he is wrestling with these same questions. And he talked about Jesus as much as if he had been, having written theology instead of, all the music he's written. But Moby and I were talking, and, when it comes to Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, and I just want to put this idea forward to you, and you don't have to agree or disagree, but I'd like your comment on it. I was telling him that my own reading and my own life journey has taken me to a position where I really feel we've got the horse and cart backward. When I look at the teachings of Jesus, I don't think they resonate because of Jesus. I think they resonate because of the very core nature of how we evolved to be a species that lives better in community and cooperation than it does in fighting. And that, you look at the teaching and the writing of evolutionary scholars and evolutionary psychology and biology these days, and you find that they've moved from this survival of the fittest idea that people like Dawkins put forward in his book, The Selfish Gene, to a new place where the phrase now that has a lot of currency is the survival of the friendliest. So it seems to me that the reason Jesus's teachings resonate with Moby or with you or with me or whomever, aside from however our mothers raised us or the churches we went to or whatever, is that there's a very deep evolutionary instinct to cooperate and to do all those things Jesus says we ought to be doing. And it's a survival instinct because the choice is do that or die. And I don't mean spiritual death, I mean literally. So children need multiple caregivers, and they need them for years because our babies are born with big heads that have to develop outside the womb for years, and child raising takes a long time. It does take a village. There are all these biological evolutionary reasons. So Jesus comes along, or some other sage or rabbi, whomever, and basically succinctly draws up a list of sayings, or is purported to have done that, since we don't have any writings by Jesus. And those sayings last best when they resonate with who we actually are. Now, my father, the apologist Francis Schaeffer, would have turned around and said something to the effect of, aha, you see, that is because this is the nature of human beings as created by God in God's image. And so it reflects that. And he would have used that as an argument. But I think that you can equally say that morality preceded religion and teachings by people like Jesus. They only resonate because they happen to be true to the human condition. And essentially, religion itself is superfluous because what we really need to be listening to is evolution and what it has instructed us to do. And Jesus does a good job at doing that. Now, I'm not saying that's entirely my view, but I just want to throw that out to you because I respect your brain and I want to hear from your brain. How does that strike you if we were having this conversation over a drink in a bar?
Oh gosh, I could use a beer right now, I think.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're allowed to have one,
Except I'm in my cottage. There's not.
If you want to take a break and go to the fridge. I've still got a grandchild to care for this afternoon when we're done. So I'll wait and have my drink later, but you go ahead.
Well, I think that the way that you point out this passage about me reading the Bible and
Right.
what my friend Pete N says about the Bible. And part of the way that I understand the Bible is that it is a collection of experiences, of insights, of wisdom, of people trying to deal with questions just like this. And my sense is that the major narrative arc of the Bible is that here were these people who understood God in a certain way, that the Jews, the ancient Hebrews, and they were looking around, and it seemed like they were losing out actually in history, and that the bad guys, the Babylonians and the Egyptians, who lived on either side of them, that they were the people who, potentially were like the winners of history. And so they have a question, it's like, well, wait a second.
Yeah.
What does this mean? And so in that act of ritual and reflection that they did over a time, that they came to the conclusion that we were created for community. And that's the garden story, and Adam and Eve and the animals, and God walking around with Adam and Eve, and everything was harmonious.
Mm-hmm.
So we were created for community in creation. And then something happened. And the thing that Jews, of course, think happened is that we encountered this idea of conscience. And as soon as you encounter the idea that human beings have a conscience, which is the tree of life, the tree of good and evil.
Sure.
And so as soon as you have this idea that there's conscience, then you understand that human beings have choices. And so whereas before it was all harmonious, now all of a sudden, somehow we had choices to make between good and evil. And you get to Genesis 4, and what happens is the sin is not that they ate the fruit and had conscience, that the fruit gave them the capacity for this moral choice.
Yeah.
And you get to Genesis 4, and that's where the word sin first occurs. And what is the first sin? The first sin is violence. And so the biblical narrative itself teaches us that the abuse of conscience, that our ability to choose what is not God,
Yeah.
that will lead to us actually committing these acts of violence in which we destroy our own family. The Cain and Abel story.
Yeah.
And so and as the Old Testament unfolds, you go a little further down into the narrative and you get to Deuteronomy, and God says to the people of Israel through Moses, I lay before you today two ways, a way of life and a way of death. And clearly says, you choose. And the Ten Commandments, of course, are the outline of the moral way of life. What you're talking about is that moral consciousness, a way of goodness that creates community, that sustains relationships, that builds people's senses, I think, of empathy, sympathy, compassion, which are things that have built in the human race over time. And this other way, the way of death, that was the way of Cain and Abel, that continual choosing of doing harm to even your closest family members. And so that the Hebrew scriptures become that story between the times in which Israel chose well and the times in which Israel chose badly.
Yeah.
And so I think the sense that Jesus then enters into that story, and Jesus is always urging people to choose well, love God, love your neighbor, understand that the poor are blessed. At the end, I love Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus is laying out this, kind of scenario of judgment. And the people who are ushered into the love and union with God are people who cared for prisoners and took care of widows and orphans, and who shared clothes and food with the poor. And the people who go the wrong way are those who have chosen war and violence and being cut off from their neighbors. And so that's the story.
That's the story. Yeah. But my question and my point, I won't call it a point. My question, that has seemed more obvious to me as years have gone by, is that none of this would have resonated with human beings if the evangelical version of this story that you just told was true. And that was until the Bible came along and showed us how to be.
Right.
And until Jesus further refined how to be, we didn't know any of this stuff.
That's correct.
We needed all of this. And of course, and I'll just throw out a random example. 53,000 years ago, according to the latest studies on this subject, human beings and dogs bonded and co-evolved from there on to the point we now share cancers together. We share the same hormonal structures in our brains and experiences of love. Because someone decided that instead of killing all the wolves, we would throw one a bone, and that one drew near to the fire, started protecting that family, and you had this kind of cooperation between canine and human. Before there was writing, maybe before there was language, a long time before anybody had even thought of inventing a god or gods or goddesses or anything else. And at the very beginning of human consciousness, we have so much bonding in a sort of an empathetic manner that we're even doing it with a canine species outside of our own tribe. Our hunter-gatherers are going out and very soon learn that if you don't share, your own people are going to die. Now there's no one to defend the camp. There's no one to raise the babies. They didn't need Jesus for this, or the Bible, or the Jews, or the Christians, or anyone else. This is why human beings are still here at all, because they were not all Cain, murdering Abel, or we'd all be gone in the first breath. So what I don't understand so much about my own background is the lack of humility that says, 5,000 years ago, we invented some writing. 10,000 years before that, we were, identified as these creatures. 53,000 years ago, we were bonding with dogs. 100,000 years before that, we were not who we are today. And we're acting as if the only reason we're here is if somehow none of that history occurred, but we got Jesus in the Bible a few minutes ago, and that showed us the way. Well, it didn't, because we're here because evolution essentially favored those who did what Jesus told us thousands of years after we were already doing that. And I think that I was raised on the idea that if we didn't have this book, we wouldn't know any of this stuff. Mothers wouldn't love their children. It would just be war and chaos everywhere. Excuse me. It wouldn't be, because the very process of evolution itself taught these lessons. And the only reason any of this resonates, or I'll put it another way, the only reason any religion survives and becomes a global force is if somewhere in that religion is a nugget of something that actually ties into the reality of who human beings are, which are creatures that evolved to cooperate. Religions that don't go in that direction go the way of Stalinism, and they go away. And so, I just want to throw that out there in the strongest terms and get your reaction to it.
Well, honestly, my strongest reaction is I think that there's incredible level what you're saying that is quite correct. I lean now theologically into something that's referred to as process theology.
Yeah.
And process theologians understand that creation is very ancient, and that it has been speaking something sacred since before our wildest imaginings.
Yeah.
And so as a person who looks back beyond the last 2,000 or 4,000 or 6,000 years, just in these biblical monotheistic traditions, Richard Rohr talks about this in his book, The Universal Christ. It's basically, what can you say? Jesus 2,000 years ago, that's like a half of a blink of an eye in the cosmic timeline. And so the idea that there is something built into the cosmos that is about the expansion of compassion. Yeah. I can't prove it, but I definitely trust that there is some, and this is where probably I would have some disagreements with some scientists, but I do trust there is some sort of, I guess, ethical desire that is part of the evolutionary process. And
predates everything we're talking about, and even predates language, let alone theology or any concept of God or anything, by millennia.
That's
not
correct.
Like a few minutes.
It predates all of it. And I think the thing that was getting me kind of riled up as soon as you were talking is, I actually believe that the impulse in some Christian traditions to extinct other religions comes from this. Right. Because if you think about the Christian encounter in the 15th century and 16th centuries with indigenous peoples around the world. Right. You have, and this does not say that Christians were all bad and indigenous peoples were all good, but the question was, here you had these cultures that were untouched by any level of the Jesus story and any level of monotheism as we would know it. Sure. And yet they were doing those things that you talked about. Mothers loved children. They had developed, confederacies of peacemakers in order to protect their societies. Yeah. I mean, all kinds of stuff that was empathetic and compassionate and morally acceptable, while they also had things that were not so good. Because human beings are like that. Human beings make great choices. Human beings make bad choices. Yeah. But when Christians ran into those cultures, there was no other way. They either had to say that they had to be converted because they got everything wrong. Yeah. And they'd been godless since the very beginning, or you had to exterminate them. Yeah, because in a way, their very presence and cohesion and compassion is a rebuke, because it's like, then what do we need Jesus for? They're doing all this stuff anyway. That's exactly right. Yeah. That becomes problematic for mission culture. I mean, deeply problematic.
Yeah, and tradition we understand. I have a question from Susan, who says, you both speak of reverting to things, practices you know from childhood. I was raised not in church, converted as a teen, went in deep, and I'm now out again. My question is, how much of where you find yourselves in a post-evangelical practice is, in a sense, a reversion in practice to what you know because of how you were raised?
I love that question. um, in a very real way, freeing Jesus answers the question. And what I do is try to show that you can honor your own journey. And so I take my readers through my earliest memories of Jesus as friend and teacher, and then my evangelical memories, Jesus as Savior and Lord, and then more recent memories of Jesus as the way and Jesus as presence.
Yeah.
And I don't romanticize any of those, nor do I particularly attack any of those. Instead, I simply tell the stories. This is what I've learned through my life. And then, as 62-year-old Diana, I evaluate each one of those different ideas and pick up the aspects of them that are meaningful to my life now. So
Yeah.
while I loved writing actually the chapters on Jesus as friend and teacher in the middle of a pandemic, because I couldn't see my friends and I had no one to teach.
Yeah.
And so to write these 2 chapters about my earliest memories of Jesus was glorious. It was healing. It was life-giving for me.
Yeah.
But what I learned is I don't experience Jesus as friend like I did when I was 3.
Yeah, no, I totally get that.
Yeah, so I kept the idea, but I don't revert to it.
Yeah.
I
where I find myself reverting a little more is in the area of childcare with these youngest grandchildren of mine. I find that my answers to them are ones that my mother would like better than what I talk about with you, because there I'm confronted with children asking questions as children. And of course, I go back to the answers I was given as a child. Now I modify those so that I read Bible stories to them. I also read them a lot of Greek mythology. And Nora, when she was 5, I asked her, we say grace at the table. I do all the things that would please my mother, but here's what would not have pleased my mother. When Nora was 5, I said to her, Nora, would you like to say grace? She's heard Greek mythology and Bible stories. And I've never said one is true and you'll go burn in hell if you don't believe it, and the other is just a story. My mother would have made that very clear. This is just stories. Ours is true. So I asked her to say grace, and she folded her hands very piously, which is funny because we don't do that, which means she's been looking at art and pictures of people with praying like this. Yeah. And she says, "Oh, Athena and all the gods, we thank you for this food." And I thought, I heard my mother just spinning in her grave. I mean, it was like, okay, that's not how you say grace. And she's picked up entirely the wrong stories, but at least she's got some idea that we thank somebody out there.
It's funny because when my daughter Emma was really little, all my friends are these pretty well-known, theologians and Bible critics. And one of my closest friends when he was still alive was Marcus Borg, who was very well-known New Testament scholar. And Marcus loved Emma. He was kind of like a second uncle to her. And whenever we visited their house in Oregon, he would always take her for these drives and they'd go out hiking together and all this kind of stuff. And I never really knew what they talked about. So one Christmas, Emma comes home. It's a few weeks before Christmas, and she comes home from Sunday school, and we're driving home in the car. So we raised her in the Episcopal Church. And she said, "Mom, we talked about the wise men today in Sunday school." And I said, "Oh, you did? What did you talk about?" And she said, "Did you know there are Christians who think the wise men were real?" And I said, "Oh, there are? Well, tell me about it." And she said, "Uncle Marcus says that that Matthew made up the wise men to make the point that Jesus was king." And she said, "But the people in my Sunday school class, they think the wise men were like real."
Yeah.
And so here she was being raised in church, but she heard these other ways of interpreting the stories from the time she was really young. And she has literally, she's 23 now. She majored in religious studies at the University of Virginia, and she has literally had to deconstruct nothing.
Yeah. 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 It's
And
a huge difference.
I kind of like, I'm astonished, and it's so beautiful. And people say, well, did she lack wonder about Christmas? And it's like, no,
Yeah.
not at all, because the beauty of the idea of a gift-giving God who becomes embodied in creation, that's still communicated amazingly through the rituals and the hymns and the celebration. And that's the point. And we didn't have to clutter it up with all these, these other kinds of things saying, oh, you have to believe XYZ. We were just very straightforward about it and said, these are stories.
Yeah. And of course, from my background, the very fact that you could discuss any part of scripture as just, hey, maybe this part's just a story, or they made it up to make a point, would have been like, well, then you're not a real Christian, but that.
Right.
Okay. So I'm gonna wrap this up, but I want everybody to understand that this is a good book. And Freeing Jesus is really excellent. If you've never read anything else of Diana Butler Bass, I start with this one because it's really good. And I've just read it, so it's very fresh in my mind. I only pulled two of the quotes out, but they fit in well with what you were talking about, weren't they?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, they did. That was a nice happenstance. So
I'm very glad that you like this book, by the way, because
I do like it.
Yeah, because I thought I keep you in mind a lot when I write.
Thank you.
Just because I think your story is so fascinating, and also I think you bear witness to evangelicalism in some pretty important and meaningful ways. And I would like my work to be able to speak to the heart of that.
Well, I'll pay you the highest compliment I know how to pay a book, and then I'll stop you because you're being too nice to me. I'm not used to this.
Frank, I'm always nice to you.
Yeah, you're always nice to me. But Freeing Jesus is a book that I plan on giving my 12-year-old granddaughter, Lucy, to read, because we have a lot of discussions coming out of my criticisms of things and what she hears, but her ongoing interests. And I want her to understand that, I want her to hear the beautiful articulation you've made of why her old crazy grandfather is still all bound up with questions about this. And this book kind of explains that, because you've written a very luminous text. Thank you. And thank you for taking the time here. So we will draw a line under this, and I'll remind people you're watching Frank Schaeffer live on YouTube. This will be on Facebook. It is all available as a podcast. Please sign up, subscribe, do all the things that keep people like me floating along and able to make programs like this. And I hope I run into you out on the road somewhere or sooner. And all the best with the book. Keep me posted on how it all goes, and share this with people, because I think this interview is a good one about your book.
Well, thank you. You ask great questions, and you always keep me on my toes.
Well, much love to you, and happy birthday to your husband.
Thank you. It's good to see you, and I'm looking forward to that next time we're together too.